It's 1970, a warm summer night in Detroit. The street lamps flicker as a low rumble echoes through the air. Suddenly, a Pontiac GTO roars past, its V8 singing a symphony of raw power. As it fades into the distance, you can't help but smile. You've just witnessed the peak of an era, the zenith of American muscle. Fast forward to today, we're counting down the top 10 V8 engines that define that golden age. These aren't just power plants, they're the very soul of muscle car culture. So pop the hood and let's dive into America's greatest hits. Picture this, it's 1967 and Chevy decides to drop a nuclear bomb into the Corvette. That bomb, the L88 427. On paper, it's rated at 430 horses, but here's the kicker. That number is about as honest as a politician's promise. In reality, this beast was pushing close to 500 horsepower. The L88 wasn't just an engine, it was Chevy's middle finger to racing regulations. It turned the Corvette from a sports car into a street-legal race car. With 470 pound-feet of torque, it had enough grunt to pull a freight train. But what made the L88 truly special was its rarity. Chevy didn't want this engine in the hands of everyday drivers. It was built for the track, and they made sure buyers knew it. No radio, no air conditioning. Heck, they even gave it a laughably small 80-quart radiator that would overheat if you looked at it funny in traffic. This wasn't a Sunday cruiser. It was a weekend warrior built for those who lived life a quarter mile at a time. If the muscle car era was a movie, the Pontiac 389 would be the opening act that steals the show. This powerhouse didn't just start the muscle car era, it kicked the door down and announced its arrival with a roar. In 1964, Pontiac stuffed this bad boy into the GTO, and the world was never the same. With up to 368 horsepower, the 389 wasn't just an engine, it was the battle cry of a new automotive age. What made the 389 so special wasn't just its power, but its versatility. Pontiac offered it in a variety of configurations, from the base 4-barrel carb setup to the fire-breathing tri-power version with 3 2-barrel carbs. This meant you could have your GTO any way you wanted it, mild enough to cruise Main Street or wild enough to dominate the drag strip. The 389's legacy goes beyond just numbers. It changed the way Americans thought about performance cars. No longer were speed and power reserved for expensive sports cars. Now, the average Joe could walk into a Pontiac dealership and drive out with a car that could smoke just about anything on the road. The 389 democratized performance, and for that, it earned its place in automotive history. Ford wasn't about to let Chevy and Pontiac have all the fun. Enter the 428 Cobra Jet. This 7-liter monster found its way into the 1969 Ford Mustang Mach 1, and suddenly Ford was speaking the language of torque fluently. Ford claimed 335 horsepower, but that's like saying Godzilla is just a lizard. With 460 pound-feet of torque, the Cobra Jet could pull stumps and break hearts with equal ease. It was the Blue Oval's way of saying, yeah, we can do muscle too. The Cobra Jet's story is one of corporate subterfuge and racing dominance. Ford knew they needed something special to compete in NHRA superstock drag racing, so they took their 428 Police Interceptor engine, beefed it up with better breathing heads, a radical cam, and an intake manifold designed for a 427. The result was an engine that could propel a Mustang through the quarter mile in the mid-13s right off the showroom floor. But the real magic of the Cobra Jet was in its official horsepower rating. By underrating the engine at 335 horsepower, Ford kept insurance companies off their backs and gave their customers a wink and a nod. Everyone knew these engines were pushing well over 400 horsepower, but on paper they were just another mid-range muscle car. It was Detroit's version of having your cake and eating it too. Dodge looked at the muscle car wars and thought, what if we just add more of everything? The result was the 446-pack. This 7.2-liter behemoth came with not one, not two, but 3 2-barrel carburetors. Because sometimes too much is just enough. With 390 horsepower and a tire-shredding 490 pound-feet of torque, the 446-pack turned cars like the Super Bee and Road Runner into asphalt-devouring monsters. It was Mopar's way of bringing a gun to a knife fight, and then setting the gun on fire for good measure. The 6-pack setup wasn't just about raw power, it was about power delivery. The outer 2 carbs were vacuum-operated, kicking in only when you really put your foot down. This meant you could cruise around town on just 1 carb, sipping fuel like a mid-sized sedan. But crack open those other 4 barrels and all hell would break loose. What really set the 446-pack apart was its streetability. While the legendary 426 Hemi was a temperamental beast best suited for the drag strip, the 446-pack was happy to play nice in traffic and then unleash fury when the light turned green. It was the perfect combination of everyday drivability and weekend warrior performance. Oldsmobile might sound like your grandpa's car brand, but the 455 Rocket was anything but tame. This 7.5-liter Titan found its way into the 1974 42 W30, and suddenly Oldsmobile was the name on every speed freak's lips. With up to 400 horsepower and a massive 500 pound-feet of torque, the 455 Rocket lived up to its name. It didn't just accelerate, it achieved low Earth orbit. This engine proved that Oldsmobile knew how to party, and it brought enough power to keep that party going all night long. The 455 Rocket was a masterclass in American engineering. Oldsmobile used a forged steel crank, forged aluminum pistons, and a high-lift cam to create an engine that was as durable as it was powerful. But the real party trick was the forced air induction system. Dubbed the W machine setup, it used a fiberglass hood with functional air scoops to ram cool air into the carburetor at high speeds. What made the 455 Rocket truly special was its ability to put power to the ground. In an era when many muscle cars were little more than drag strip specials with license plates, the 442 W30 was a well-rounded performer. It could hold its own on a road course just as easily as it could rip down the quarter mile. The 455 Rocket wasn't just about straight-line speed, it was about total performance. Just when you thought Pontiac couldn't get any more insane, they dropped the 455 Super Duty into the 1973 Firebird Trans Am. This was Pontiac's last hurrah before emissions regulations crashed the party, and boy did they make it count. The SD 455 was like the final boss of muscle car engines. 370 horsepower might not sound world-beating today, but couple that with 500 pound-feet of torque, and you've got a recipe for tire destruction that would make even modern supercars nervous. What made the Super Duty 455 so special was its racing pedigree. This wasn't just a bored-out version of a regular production engine. It was essentially a race engine that somehow snuck its way into a street car. The block was reinforced, the rotating assembly was balanced and blueprinted, and the heads were engineered for maximum flow. But the real magic of the SD 455 was in its timing. By 1973, most muscle cars had been neutered by emissions regulations and insurance rates. The age of high compression, high horsepower engines seemed to be over. And then Pontiac drops this bombshell, proving that American muscle wasn't going down without a fight. The SD 455 wasn't just an engine. It was a defiant roar against the dying of the light. If there's one engine on this list that needs no introduction, it's the 426 Hemi. Nicknamed the elephant motor for its size and power, this 7-liter mammoth became the stuff of drag racing legend. Found in icons like the Plymouth Hemi Cuda and Dodge Charger RT, the 426 Hemi was conservatively rated at 425 horsepower and 490 pound-feet of torque, but in reality it was capable of so much more. This wasn't just an engine, it was Chrysler's declaration of war on the quarter mile. The story of the 426 Hemi is one of racing dominance and street-legal insanity. Originally developed for NASCAR, the 426 Hemi so thoroughly dominated the competition that it was effectively banned after its first year. Chrysler's response? They turned it into a street engine and created an instant legend. What made the Hemi so special was its hemispherical combustion chamber design. This allowed for larger valves, better airflow, and ultimately more power. But it wasn't just about peak numbers. The Hemi's power curve was like a linebacker's physique. Thick everywhere. From idle to redline, it pulled like a freight train. Owning a Hemi wasn't for the faint of heart. These engines were high-strung thoroughbreds that required constant attention. But for those willing to put up with the hassle, the reward was simple. The baddest engine on the street, bar none. Sometimes a manufacturer builds an engine so potent, it scares even them. That's the story of Ford's 427 Cammer. This single overhead cam monster was Ford's nuclear option in the horsepower wars. With a race-tuned output of 616 horsepower and 500 to 75 pound-feet of torque, the Cammer was less of an engine and more of a controlled explosion. It saw limited production, making it into only a handful of Fairlane Thunderbolts. The Cammer wasn't just rare, It was the automotive equivalent of capturing lightning in a bottle. The Camry's story is one of engineering brilliance and corporate warfare. Developed as Ford's answer to Chrysler's domination in NASCAR with the 426 Hemi, the Camry pushed the boundaries of what was possible with pushrod engine design. The single overhead cam setup allowed for higher revs and better breathing, resulting in power numbers that were almost unbelievable for the time. But the Camry's greatest triumph was also its downfall. NASCAR took one look at this engine and promptly banned it before it ever turned a wheel in competition. The Camry was simply too powerful, too advanced for the racing series of its time. Ford was left with a race engine with nowhere to race. A handful of Camry engines made their way into drag racing, where they quickly established dominance. But for street use, the Camry remained a tantalizing what-if, a glimpse of what might have been if racing regulations and practicality hadn't gotten in the way. Buick might be your dentist's car of choice now, but back in 1970, they were busy building torque monsters. The 455 Stage 1 was their magnum opus, a 7.5-liter behemoth that found its home in the Skylark GSX. With 360 horsepower and an earth-rotating 510 pound-feet of torque, the Stage 1 set torque records that stood for decades. This wasn't just Buick flexing. This was Buick rewriting the laws of physics with cast iron and gasoline. What made the 455 Stage 1 so special was its focus on real-world performance. While other manufacturers were locked in a horsepower arms race, Buick zeroed in on torque. The result was an engine that could pull like a locomotive from just off idle. In an era of high-strung, peaky engines, the Stage 1 was a beacon of civilized brutality. But don't mistake civilized for soft. The Stage 1 package included a radical cam, bigger valves, and a specially tuned carburetor. This wasn't just a big engine, it was a finely tuned performance power plant, and it had the numbers to back it up. In stock form, the GSX Stage 1 could run the quarter mile in the low 13s, numbers that would embarrass many modern performance cars. The 455 Stage 1 proved that muscle cars didn't need to be uncivilized brutes. It delivered supercar performance wrapped in Buick luxury, creating a unique blend of comfort and terror that few engines before or since have managed to match. And here we are, the king of the hill, the alpha and the omega of muscle car engines, the Chevrolet 454 LS6. Found in the 1970 Chevelle SS, this 7.4-liter colossus was the final word in the muscle car power wars. 450 horsepower, 500 pound-feet of torque, numbers that would make modern sports cars blush. The LS6 wasn't just powerful, it was a force of nature wrapped in sheet metal. It turned the Chevelle into the ultimate street warrior, a car that didn't just win at the lights, it rewrote the rulebook. The 454 LS6 wasn't just an engine, it was the culmination of an era, the peak of a mountain built on cubic inches and raw power. It was the mic drop moment of the muscle car age, a final roar before emissions regulations in the oil crisis brought the curtain down. What made the LS6 so special wasn't just its power output, but its accessibility. This wasn't some limited production race motor. You could walk into any Chevy dealership and order a Chevelle with this monster under the hood. It was the democratization of supercar performance, available to anyone with the cash and the courage. The LS6 was built to take abuse. With 4-bolt mains, forged internals, and a solid lifter cam, this was an engine that begged to be revved to the moon. In stock form, a Chevelle SS 454 LS6 could run the quarter mile in the high 13s. But that was just the beginning. The LS6 was a tuner's dream, responding well to even basic modifications. It wasn't uncommon for LS6-equipped cars to dip into the 12s with just a few tweaks. The 454 LS6 represented the peak of the muscle car era. It was the biggest, baddest, most powerful engine you could get in a production car. It was Chevrolet's way of saying, "Top this." And for all intents and purposes, no one did. And there you have it, the top 10 V8 engines from the golden era of muscle cars. Each one a legend, the heartbeat of American performance, the soul of an era that valued cubic inches over fuel economy and raw power over political correctness. Did we miss your favorite muscle car V8? Maybe you've got a story about one of these beasts. Drop a comment below and let us know.